improving by 15% could lead to a substantial, GDP per capita increase, which could be as much as 1% GDP per capita a year.
The idea that imports are bad, exports are good, and therefore if we have tariffs being implemented against us, or indeed our consumers are having to buy certain things and pay those tariffs for the countries, actually what is happening is we are getting poorer.
When New Zealand and China did a trade deal, New Zealand Treasury, various other people modelled what it would be. It achieved the level of trade. It achieved in 11 months.
Hello and welcome to the IEA podcast. My name is Reem Ibrahim and I'm the Head of Media and Linda Whetstone Scholar here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today I have a very special guest. I'm very delighted to be joined by Shanker Singham, who is one of the world's leading international trade and competition lawyers / economists. He has represented governments and multinational companies and has played a pivotal role in many major economic shifts over the last 35 years. Obviously, that includes the UK's exit from the European Union, the tariffs that we saw earlier this year. There is so much that Shanker has done. He's also the CEO of Capita, a chairman of the Growth Commission, but most importantly, he is an IEA fellow and was the director of the International Trade and Competition Unit. Shanker, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.
So you're about to publish a book. I think it's coming out in 2026. Is that right? We can hold it up to.
Well, this book has already been published.
So already has been published. Oh, fantastic!
Only about a month ago.
Oh, so brilliant! Amazing.
That's the book.
Okay, so it's International Trade, Regulation, and the Global Economy, the Impact of Anti-Competitive Market Distortions. So there is so much to this. You sort of described it as the economic companion to your previous book on competition law. And there is so much to discuss, I think, specifically when it comes to the context of this. Of course, we saw Trump's tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs earlier this year, and the amount of trade barriers that have now been put up. We are definitely, I think, living in a world in which the sort of free trade consensus seems to be breaking down. So let's talk specifically about anti-competitive market distortions. So the term that you sort of coined about 25 years ago, I was joking that it's older than me. So can you tell me what is an anti-competitive market distortion? Yeah,
so the way we define that term is that it's really anything, government action, government practice, regulation, administrative action, whatever, that distorts the ordinary market competition effects. So it obviously operates across a number of different dimensions. It operates across the trade dimension, so traditional trade barriers, tariffs, other non-tariff barriers, border barriers. These are all types of anti-competitive market distortion. Then you have inside the market domestic regulations, so regulations that artificially reduce cost for producers in that market or artificially increase costs for importers or for exporters into that market. Those also adversely affect the ordinary competitive relationship between willing buyer and willing seller meeting in voluntary exchange. And then the third sort of big area is property rights. So property rights, weakness in protecting property rights, intellectual property rights, those sorts of things. Because we regard the property right as and the intellectual property right as part of an overall property right. As opposed to a government monopoly to stimulate innovation, which is the way a lot of people think about IP. The sort of John Lockean vision of IP is it's actually part of the property right itself.
And what do those distortions look like specifically in terms of regulatory barriers, tariffs, non-tariff trade barriers?
It's a little bit like Olympic sport and drug taking by athletes. So the number and variety of these distortions are legion, and governments are very clever at distorting markets in very difficult ways to understand and penetrate. So there could be things like a law that gives a particular amount of protection or privilege to a particular company or a particular group of companies. Obviously, China is the poster child for a lot of this, massive distortions in favor of their state-owned sector, but also privileges and other things given to private companies as well. So it could be that. It could be a toleration of intellectual property violations, for example. It could be a difficulty in customs process. Most of them, I mean, what's interesting, or what we do in the book is we look at these three pillars: trade, competition, and property rights, and we look at how much they move GDP per capita. So if you get a 1 point increase, it's an econometric model, and we can come to what that is specifically, but basically what we're saying is a 15% typically for a developed country improvement in those three pillar scores leads to a particular GDP per capita increase.
Wow.
And what's interesting is they're not the same. So in the trade pillar, it's typically 15% increase is typically a between 4 and 6% GDP per capita increase, state to state, right? So it takes time to get there. So it's not an immediate thing, but over, let's say, 5 to 10 years, this is the sort of effect you can get if you improve the trade picture of that country by 15%. Do the same thing with domestic competition and regulation. It's between 8 and 11%, so almost double what you'd get from the trade pillar. And the property rights pillar is somewhere in between the two. So what this is telling us is that improving your own market and making your own market pro-competitive, eliminating all the distortions in your own market. And in the UK, we have a lot of distortions in our own market about favor incumbents. So changing that, even improving by 15%, could lead to a substantial, GDP per capita increase, which could be as much as 1% GDP per capita year on year. So if you look at the gap that we have in terms of what GDP per capita increases used to be in the 80s and 90s and what they are now, that's really the gap. You could solve a gap with just that. But you want, a successful country wants to do all three.
I mean, that is 15% is enormous, right? That is an enormous chunk of GDP. And I think that what is rather interesting, at least in the current modern context of where we, of course, are seeing reciprocal tariff arrangements, it's the idea that imports are bad, exports are good. And therefore, if we have tariffs being implemented against us, or indeed our consumers are having to buy certain things and pay those tariffs to other countries, actually what is happening is we are getting poorer. Therefore, the way that we stop this is by implementing a reciprocal arrangement, a reciprocal tariff. And this challenges that idea, right? The idea that domestically, if you solve those problems, if you remove those distortions, you will be richer.
Yeah, I mean, you have to do it all. That's the problem. So, and if you look at the history of this, and we start in the book with the famous Angus Madison GDP curve, which shows how much GDP increased in the world. And basically it doesn't move at all between 0 and 1932. And then after the war, 1947, it just rockets up, and it's about 6 or 7-fold increase in about 50 years compared to a doubling in the last 1900 years. So the question is, what happened in that period that caused this massive increase in economic growth? And certainly, if you look at this from an ACND sort of perspective, you could say we made a lot of progress on tariff reduction in one area, industrial goods, basically. So a relatively small part of the global economy created that amount of growth from the transnational supply chain and all of these things, efficiencies and wealth creation and so on. But the intention of the trading system in 1947 was actually to move forward on all three branches of anti-competitive market distortions. And it was only because the Congress in the US essentially decided that these were matters of internal affairs. And therefore, they didn't want to subject those internal affairs to a sort of international structure. So we lost all of that, and we were left with this contract, the GATT, and that sort of continued until the 1980s. But it's important to remember that the intention was to deal with all three things. And we started in the 70s and 80s to deal with some of these other things. So we started to deal with government procurement, and in the Euro around intellectual property and services and all these other things. And unfortunately, what happened then was in 1997, we were supposed to deal with competition and investment. So like the two other pillars of the ACMD, the three pillars. And we were supposed to capture all of those gains in the Seattle trade round, which was supposed to be launched in 1999. Well, of course, we failed to get any agreement on Singapore issues in 1997. We failed to launch the Seattle round in 1999, and we haven't had a serious global round of trade negotiations since 1999, which is a huge period, 26 years, like third, almost now a half, almost getting up to a half of the lifetime of the GATT itself. And so what happened as a result is that the trading system requires countries to lower their tariffs, liberalize their markets, and all countries to do this. So if I'm country A and I'm trading with country B, and country B has masses of distortions and is artificially lowering the costs of its producers, is artificially increasing the costs of your producers in country A, so you can't get into that market, what happens? Your producers in country A go bust. People lose their jobs. This is what happened in the 2010s and 2000s and 2010s. And instead of saying, well, you know what, we just didn't do the second the second and third pillars. We didn't make sufficient progress. Let's go back to the drawing board, but let's not lose the gains we've made on the tariff side. But that's not what people do. What people say is they throw the whole thing out. So you have Chavez in Venezuela, and various other leaders who come along to protect their people. Now, President Trump is not wrong to say that these distortions have been rife and increasing massively over the last 25 years. He's not wrong to say what we've tried to do about them has not been successful, because clearly it hasn't. The scale of these distortions has increased enormously. Just to give you an example, in the US, there was a machine learning study that showed that 35 to 37% of market power increases were due to the federal rulebook. In other words, companies going and getting federal regulation to block their competitors from success. 35 to 37% of market power. So that's just the US, which is a relatively good care. So, but in other countries, it's obviously China is off the charts in that respect. So now we can disagree with the approach, but I think what we do need is an integrated trade policy that includes dealing with the distortions in other countries and dealing with the lack of property rights protection in other countries in the round. And had we done that, with regard to China WTO accession, for example, we could have avoided a lot of these effects. And we could have avoided the situation that we sort of find ourselves in now. And it's not just a developed country thing. It's not just, you lose steel workers in Pennsylvania and Ohio and also here in Redcar and Port Talbot. There's been devastating effects in developing countries. So Central America used to have a textile industry. Textile industry had these special quotas for developed countries. As a result of the WTO, those quotas were eliminated. But no one was paying attention to the fact that China had just joined the WTO system. So, of course, when these quotas were eliminated, China textile producers, who were massively distorted, free money, free land, free water, free everything, just completely wiped out the Central American textile producers, literally in 24 to 48 hours. I mean, it was that quick. One can make an argument that they probably would not have survived even if China had not been so distortive. But I would argue that it would have taken a bit more time and there would have been a transitional period for them. But when they went out of business immediately, it's no surprise that a couple of decades later, you've got queues of Central American men at the southern border in the US trying to get into the US because you've taken away their main industry. So, so we've not succeeded in dealing with those issues. And what we've argued is that this formalism, this framework, this normative framework of distortions, ought to ground the approach of the US administration. So if a country lowers its distortions, its tariff goes down as well. And that the tariff should correlate to the distortions. Now, one of the problems is that the tariff, it doesn't really correlate to the distortions, and is very much more focused on the size of the deficit. So what we would argue is, I don't really care about the deficit. I do care about the distortions. So they should eliminate their distortions. If they eliminate their distortions and there's still a deficit, fine, that's not a problem. But at the moment, unless we answer this problem of unfairness, which is why should I lose my job because this Chinese company is benefiting massively from distortions, we're always going to be in the situation where you have a populist leader who takes advantage of that anger, that anger that is justified.
And what would you say, perhaps, to the alternative argument? I do think it's interesting, and we'll get into what you view the sort of the correct approach the US government, for example, should take. But what would you say to the argument that perhaps it doesn't matter that China is massively subsidizing their industries or creating all of these distortions? It isn't our job, to ensure that those countries are behaving correctly. It isn't our job to ensure that China is implementing sound economic policy. Actually, what we should be doing is ensuring that our consumers are better off, and we should just completely ignore and not care why a good is cheaper from China, for example.
Yeah. So several things wrong with that view. I mean, first of all, I would say that actually we are interested in global GDP per capita growth, and if you don't have voluntary exchange between willing buyer and willing seller because one party is distorting its market, you're going to contract the overall size of the market. So as we show here, GDP per capita is destroyed by anti-competitive market distortions. In fact, we did a thought experiment here where we said, okay, let's imagine that from 1990 to 2016, academic exercise, we actually eliminated all anti-competitive distortions in the world. And we used our economic model to measure that. The loss or the gain of doing that from in that period to 2016 was about $50,000 GDP per capita. So imagine that over the world. There's trillions of dollars. The world would look very different. You would not have resource conflicts. You would not have scarcity problems. You would not have any of these things because so what these distortions are doing is they are destroying wealth from the world. And that's why we should care about them. But we should also care about them from narrow parochial interests, because if we don't care about them, all that's going to happen is producer losses will incur in developed countries, or indeed any country that is a partner to that country, and that will create a backlash. And the backlash will result in what we've seen. It will result in medicine that's often worse than the disease. But in any event, it will result in more distortion. So you'll have a distortion in response to the distortion, and that's the wrong direction of travel. So the right direction of travel. Go back to Cobden. Cobden did not say just lower prices for our consumers. Cobden didn't talk about the price of bread going down as the goal. He talked about the market price of bread. So that's what you should go for, because that's what grows the economy the most. And so, especially in a world of transnational supply chains, they're all connected. So I think and if it was the case from our model that the trade pillar was the big mover, and I think intuitively we kind of think that we think that it's getting rid of the tariffs that's the main thing, the free trade agreements are the main thing, and lower those tariffs, everything else falls away. But first of all, the evidence is that the domestic competition and the property rights pillar are bigger movers of economic growth, first of all. But secondly, the problem with just focusing on the tariff and not on anything else is why is the tariff there? It's there because somebody's put it there. It's protecting some interest, some industry. If that tariff is removed, all that industry will do is it will find protection in alternative and more difficult to deal with forms, which are usually anti-competitive barriers. So, for example, there was a interesting case in Japan in the 1980s where Japan loved baseball just like the US. So all these baseball bats from the US were being sent to Japan, and the Japanese, and the tariff had come down and so on. So the Japanese instead enacted a rule whereby a baseball bat had to be a certain length, which coincidentally was the length that the Japanese manufactured and made their baseball bats and not the US. So countries are very, very clever.
They seek protection through regulation if it is tariffs.
And so you can't just only think about the tariff. You have to think about the whole, the whole thing.
So let's talk a bit about that second pillar, the sort of anti-competitive aspect of this, and sort of the regulations that we're seeing very specifically. I mean, that Japanese bat manufacturers, I think, is a very good example. What is the situation that we're currently seeing ourselves in, where we know that countries domestically implement regulations? Of course, we know we've got supranational institutions like the EU that implement huge swathes of regulations that are anti-competitive. Can you talk a bit about the current situation we're in, and then how you're approaching that?
Yeah. So I think one of the things we've done with the model is we now have an ordinal index of distortion, so we can show you the countries that are the most distorted across all three pillars. And we can also, it's a GDP per capita measurement, so it isn't just an index of countries. It also tells you something about how far away they are from what optimal would be. And one of the unfortunate things is that you look at the top 20 countries, and you wouldn't be necessarily particularly surprised by the top 20 countries. Singapore is up at the top, and the US does pretty well. Actually, the UK does not do badly on this
compared to the rest of the world.
But what we do see is that in those top 20 countries from 2010 to 2023, which is the time period we measure, the overall mass of distortions of all of those countries has increased.
Okay.
So it's not like the top people are getting better.
Everyone's getting worse.
Everyone is getting worse. And there are some improvements at the bottom, but that's what you'd expect from highly distorted countries. There are a couple of very interesting exceptions on both sides. So there are a couple of interesting countries that have gone down, or they have increased their distortions, got worse, significantly in that period. And the countries that got worse, that were coming from a high day, were doing well before, are Canada, Australia, Sweden, Denmark. Now, admittedly, these were good performing countries to start with in 2010, but they have got worse. In other words, they've increased the level of their distortions, not by a small amount, by a significant amount. The only country that's improved of the top 20 is the Emirates, the UAE, actually, in that period, which is interesting. And the bottom countries that they're coming from a very low base, so it doesn't tell you very much if there's a sudden improvement in a particular place. But what is interesting is the ones at the very top, both the ones that move the most, both in the case of Singapore and the UAE, have made a big effort to improve the competitiveness of their regulatory systems. Singapore, by essentially adopting English law, Lee Kuan Yew adopted English law, which was very unusual in the region, and of course UAE does the same thing. So there is a interesting phenomenon of whether English common law has a beneficial effect on distortion reduction and making regulations more competitive and more economic.
And I think is so true. What are those specific changes in those regulatory barriers? What are they actually removing? What are they switching out? Are they sort of solidifying particular regulations? What is actually occurring?
So one of the things we argue in the book, and actually in the previous book as well, is when a country regulates, they should adopt a competition analysis. In other words, what they should do is they should say, if we are regulating, we need to analyze the effect on market competition of that regulation. And we need to only regulate in ways that are the least distortive of market competition consistent with a legitimate regulatory goal. So generally, the countries that do well do some version of that. So that takes the flow of your regulation and makes it more competitive. So you look at, because there may be many different ways of achieving a particular regulatory goal. But if you don't have that back and forth to try to figure out what's the most pro-competitive, you may end up with a knee-jerk reaction. So, for example, when the banking crisis happened, we all thought, oh, this is terrible, we need to do something. Often this is the cry that precedes regulation. Something must be done.
Yes.
And so what we did is we massively increased the capital adequacy requirement of banks. We've said, oh, it's terrible, these banks are not properly capitalized. That was the problem. Therefore, we're going to make sure they are properly capitalized by increasing the capital adequacy ratio. Well, of course, what that does is it means the smaller banks are basically kept out of the market. The banks that like having capital adequacy ratios raised are the biggest banks. So you concentrate your banking system, which is what we effectively did, and you lower competition. And that lowering of competition is tremendously destructive to wealth creation and tremendously destructive to GDP per capita. So most regulation that is anti-competitive is there because it's a combination of someone wanting it to be there because it basically enables them to outcompete their rivals. And it's also a combination of it sounds good, health and safety, prudential. It sounds like the right thing. And, I don't doubt that something should be done, but you need to make sure that the something that you're doing is not going to be so damaging to ordinary market competition that it destroys wealth out of the economy.
And do you think that the banking crisis is an example of this, where the reaction really was huge swathes of regulations that actually have made many Western countries, namely the United Kingdom, extremely uncompetitive? I mean, our financial regulations are absolutely enormous post-2008.
Yeah. No, I totally. So I think the problem is if you look at the causes of the crisis, essentially what you had, and there's been, obviously libraries written about the causes of the crisis. I want to focus on just one element of that, which is the mortgage market. And you essentially had government-owned enterprises in the US, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, that were buying mortgages from banks. There was underlying regulation that made it, if you only gave mortgages to the most qualified people, you would get into trouble with these various regulations. And so banks were carrying a lot of non-performing loans on their books because everyone wanted, the American dream for everybody, which meant you had to give mortgages to people who couldn't afford them, essentially. So this was happening. Now, the banks knew that they could just offload these loans onto a state-owned company that would never go bust. And so naturally what happens when you create this system is you get very clever people coming along and say, well, I can de-risk this with very sophisticated mathematics, and that can all be packaged and sold and
then you completely eliminate risk aversion, and so it's not really a loan; it's a government-backed loan.
Yeah, right, exactly. So these are massive government distortions. These are massive anti-competitive market distortions, and so the solution to that, what that caused, cannot be more anti-competitive market activity,
which is what we ended up with.
Which is exactly what we ended up with, and as a result of that, and it's created all kinds of consequences, like for in the UK, there is just not enough competition in the retail banking sector. You wonder why all these challenger banks fail. Well, they fail because the regulatory system is such that it's very difficult to succeed.
There was a former advisor to Trump 1.0, who came and gave a entirely good speech. He came and gave a talk to the IEA, and one of the things he said, I mean, sort of a lot of economists or people that focus on economics, I think, have this one thing, and this is the sort of silver bullet that would save everything. And his argument was actually that because of our financial regulation, and because it's basically impossible for a business to get a large loan, a lot of businesses don't have that equity. And so when you compare the US and the UK specifically, post 2008, I mean, there really was a huge drop off and a huge gap in comparison to GDP when you look at the US and the UK, especially post 2008. And he puts a lot of that down to the fact that it's impossible to get a loan. If you're a business and you want to invest and you want to take a risk, it's impossible to do so.
It's not just the banking sector. So I think in the UK, the problem is that the regulatory bias in the country favours the incumbent. And that happens for a lot of reasons. And it's carried by a lot of way we govern ourselves. So when these regulations are thought about, they generally are thought about by not by politicians, but by officials and arm's length bodies that usually consist of those same incumbents who naturally think that all these things need to be done. They tend not to be the person who's not thought about in this, the sort of, in economic terms, the forgotten man in this whole exercise, is either the small business, the new business, or more critically, the business that doesn't exist yet, that would exist if you had a pro-competitive regulatory environment. So that's, again, one of the reasons why it's so important to eliminate these distortions. And it's one of the reasons why the competition pillar has such a big effect. Because, when you have a competitive market, because that's the core of everything, really, is the willing buyer, willing seller meeting in voluntary exchange. When you have that operating normally without distortion, you're going to generate a lot of business activity. You're going to generate a lot of, willing sellers who will be finding ways to solve human needs, and that is all thwarted and damaged by these distortions.
And just specifically on competition, do you think then that the solution to a lot of these anti-competitive distortions is deregulation overall, or do you think it needs to be reciprocated across the world?
So, no, I think, I don't tend to use the word deregulation. I think it's a freighted term, and I'm not sure people fully understand what they mean by it. I do think that pro-competitive regulation, in other words, ensuring that your regulatory system should ensure that voluntary exchange has the maximum probability of occurring.
Yeah.
Again, subject to legitimate regulatory goals, and it's up to people. People can decide that if they want, but they have to also know the cost of doing it. So, for example, if I say it's a good example of this would be, it's incredibly important to have clean air and clean water. If you don't have clean air and clean water, there are all kinds of disbenefits that flow down the supply chain, downstream users of things. Those things become more expensive. It is, in fact, a distortion not to have clean air and clean water. So there are lots of areas of health and safety, prudential regulation that actually improve the quality of the market, improve competition, and generate GDP per capita, growth. So it isn't just a case of eliminating all regulation. It is a case of making sure that your regulatory system as a whole promotes competition. And there's a long way that we have to go to get to that point.
It is interesting, I think, hearing you talk about sort of special interests. And I think it's one of the aspects of regulation I think most people don't understand, specifically actually people on the left that are often arguing that lots of big businesses, lots of multinational corporations, they want less regulation because they want to just be able to do whatever they want. And actually it's often the case that
they're the ones who want the regulation.
They're the ones lobbying for the regulation because they have huge legal compliance teams. They can absorb those regulatory
costs. It's a great barrier to entry. So no, generally that is what happens. And no one really speaks for that. And certainly no one speaks for the business of the future.
No.
I mean, never mind. I mean, people don't even speak for the small businesses and the new entrants generally. You're seeing this right now in the UK with the Employment Rights Bill. So what's happening? And we actually costed, for the Growth Commission, we costed the impact, which is anywhere between 1.4 and 2.8% GDP per capita loss over a 10-year period. It's made slightly better by the change that pushes out the application of unfair dismissals for 6 months, but it's still a big loss, right? It's often played as this is about protecting the employee from the employer, and in fact, the anti-competitive regulation and labour market flexibility, by the way, is one of the biggest movers of the competition pillar itself. It's probably about 25% of the whole pillar is labour market flexibility. And when you damage labour market flexibility, i.e. you damage competition in labour, in the regulation of the labour market, which is what the ERB does, then you are actually contracting the size of the labour market, which is bad for the employer, bad for both employer and employee. And minimum wage is another example of this.
I was going to say, yeah, it's interesting where you're pricing out so many people.
Yeah, so you end up harming the very people you claim that you're. So this binary view of, which we see a lot now in the political discourse, that it's all about protecting person X from person Y. Actually, usually what happens when you have anti-competitive regulation is both person X and person Y lose.
Yeah, and in a growing economy in which there is an abundance of jobs and an abundance of workers, of labourers, if we're using that analogy, then, if you want the worker, so to speak, to have more power to negotiate for better working conditions or indeed for better wages, you need the economy to be growing. You need to ensure that money actually exists. The interesting thing about minimum wage is it doesn't cost the government anything, but the idea that businesses magically have more money to pay their workers.
Well, I mean, basically, these are all part of the sort of zero-sum fallacy.
Yeah.
So it's essentially they all come from the thinking that human interactions, those voluntary exchanges, are zero-sum in nature. But of course, they're not zero-sum; they're non-zero-sum. So you can actually create wealth, and you can actually destroy wealth.
Yeah.
And the problem is that wealth is a lot easier to destroy than to create.
And often it is the short-termism that we see with a lot of these new regulations that we end up harming wealth. Let's talk about property rights. So one of the pillars you sort of discuss is the idea that the protection of property rights, and you include intellectual property rights in this conception, which I think is interesting in itself. But the idea that when property rights aren't protected, that creates a distortion. And I think, personally, I think this is most interesting in developing countries where a lot of these sort of, I suppose you could even call them sort of non-tariff trade barriers, where actually, if you're a female entrepreneur and you are moving goods between different countries and you could have your goods seized by a government official, that is a trade barrier and it is a violation of your property rights. But we see that time and time again across different countries. Can you explain what you mean by these property rights and their violations and where these distortions are coming from at the moment?
Yeah, well, in many ways, the property right protection is the core, is the foundation. Although there are three pillars: trade, competition, and property rights. There's really two big concepts. The biggest, the foundation concept is property rights, because if you don't have property rights, then you don't have anything to compete with, and you have no way of assessing value. And writers like Hernando de Soto have talked about the importance of property rights, particularly in developing countries. And the trade is just a type of competition. It's competition across borders, and so you have competition inside the market and you have competition across borders, but it's all competition, really. So that's why property rights is so fundamental. Property rights would be anything that protects your property or your intangible assets. So your intellectual property, meaning patents, copyrights, trademarks. These are not just your ideas, because ideas are not protectable in that sense. But they are protecting the expression of your ideas. So the way you're developing that's typically how copyright works. Why intellectual property is so important, and actually in the property rights pillar, it's the biggest mover of the property rights pillar, is because, again, it's part of this non-zero sum, actual reality. If you want people to turn ideas into things that are capable of industrial application and advance the sort of progress of the world, they have to see that all of the effort that they would apply is going to generate a profit in the future. And that profit is tied to the protection of the intellectual property rights. They have to know that if they work incredibly hard to develop something, to invent something, that somebody isn't going to come along and just steal their idea and make more money than them, and they're going to lose all of their profit. So you see this particularly with things like pharmaceuticals, where in many countries there are industries that exist to copy the property rights of the actual inventors, and it leads to a contraction in the size of the overall economy. And it's very important. One of the reasons property rights is so important, it has an impact on the role of the government. The role of the government, in a way, when we look at these different things, we're looking at sort of faces of a diamond. There's lots of different faces. The diamond in its entirety is the answer to the question, why did the Madison curve go up so much? And how can we make it keep going up? How can we make human beings flourish or create environments where human beings flourish? Well, that diamond has lots of faces. And one of those faces that I talked about was wealth being easier to destroy than to create, and wealth creation being the foundation of GDP per capita growth and so forth. But when we say wealth, we don't mean money. Money is a measurement tool. When we say wealth, we mean the realization of ideas. So an economy does well when it goes from idea generation to idea crystallization as quickly as possible. And money is a measurement of how well you do that, basically. So again,
and I suppose the more barriers there are, the longer that process.
Exactly. And maybe it doesn't even occur at all. India, for it's a good example of having something like 2 or 3% of the world's academic research, but virtually none of the capable of industrial application. There's no crystallization. Lots of idea generation, but not much crystallization of ideas. The other element, the other face of the diamond, is the role of government. So what is the government's role? I mean, what is if you boil it down, the government's role is to protect your security and your property rights, and to guarantee your ability to have economic freedom. So, if somebody's monopolizing the market, that's damaging people's economic freedom, and the government is there to have antitrust laws and so forth to deal with those types of things and to protect your property and your security. But everything else is a so-called privilege, i.e., we would like people to have this, food. We would like people to be fed. We would like people to have good healthcare. We would like people to have education, or any number of things. But why this is so important to have a very limited view of the rights of a government is the government has coercive power. And if the government is granting a right, then it's going to do it backed with its coercive power. And that's going to crowd out any kind of other private sector activity. So if you said that, everyone has a right to have transportation to their work, that would mean that the government would have to nationalize the transportation system.
Yeah. And I think this is the case. I mean, I was on air with Zach Polanski about 2 weeks before he became the Green Party leader, and he said something along the lines of, food is a human right. And I said, well, what does that mean? Obviously, we want everybody to be fed, but does that mean that you would nationalise Sainsbury's? And he said, well, actually, I think there is a he would, right? But this is the consequence, the real world consequences don't matter. It's the idea that people have a right to something without really that obviously means someone's labour has to be used.
And again, as classically, there will be a forgotten man when you apply that right badly, when you over apply that right. And in the case of food distribution, if you basically nationalize food distribution, you would create scarcity and you would increase price, and ultimately the poorest people in your society would suffer. And we actually have real experience of this in the US, where the alcoholic beverages distribution system is in part nationalized. Actually, they do that in Sweden as well. But there are US states, or all US states,
Virginia, Pennsylvania,
where if you want to get spirits, you have to go to the ABC liquor store, which is a government-owned liquor store. Well, take a look at what's on offer and compare that with a private a private system of distribution, and you see very clearly, one has no real variety, and the other does, because again, competition is the most powerful force we know to actually create wealth. And if you take away competition, and government monopoly is the biggest taking of competition, then you're going to end up with, as Hovenkamp, US judge, said, the best monopoly profit is a quiet life. You'll have a quiet life and you won't distribute any products, and they'll all be very expensive.
Yes. It's interesting, I think, in the case of food, because, I mean, at least in the UK, I think very clearly our supermarket competition is one of the healthiest, I think, competitive markets that we have in the United Kingdom. And when we're talking about feeding people, it becomes an extremely sensitive topic. And yet, actually, in the UK, we don't really have starvation. It doesn't occur in the United Kingdom, thankfully. And I think a lot of that is down to the fact that you really can be fed very, very cheaply.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's what competition does.
Exactly.
It drives down price.
But if you want food to be even cheaper, let's remove some of those barriers. Let's get rid of the tariffs and quotas the EU implemented on food. That we bothered to get rid of.
Yeah, or just all of the massive environmental regulations that all of it drives up the energy price. And so we have a whole range of anti-competitive energy regulation, which are all distortions as we see them, anti-competitive market distortions as we see them. And that drives up the cost of energy. And energy is in everything. So everything is going to be more expensive if your energy cost is artificially driven up. So, artificially subsidizing a particular type of energy and not applying that same subsidy to other types of energy is a distortion. It will result in less competition. It will result in GDP per capita losses. It will result in higher prices of that product, as it has in the case of energy. So, you have to work very hard to create wealth. And if you again go back to the Madison curve, for most of mankind's history, I think we actually rounded up as 0.005%, if you assume man really becoming a sort of social animal from like 20,000 BC, let's say. The kind of prosperity that we've known in the last 50 years, or in the 50 years after the war, that is 0.005% of human history. So we can say that the natural state is poverty and war. Prosperity and peace are very unusual, unique, and you have to work very hard for them. And so it's not guaranteed that this curve will keep going up. Mm-hmm. In fact, we're already seeing some dangerous signs that it's turning down, because there was a period where we actually managed to eliminate people on less than $1 a day, living on less than $1 a day, absolute poverty, actually reduced absolute poverty in the world to zero. But that's climbing up again now. And
it's very scary indeed.
Particularly the financial crisis, particularly our approach to COVID, which was extremely damaging to developing countries. So we locked everybody down. They had young populations, much less at risk. They locked everybody down. And so the economic damage was unbelievable, much more so in developing countries than in developed countries.
I think that's definitely right. Before we move on from property rights, I just wanted to challenge your sort of conception of intellectual property rights a little bit. So, many people on our side of the silk will sort of say intellectual property rights don't count in sort of this natural rights perspective and sort of the Lockean perspective on property rights, because intellectual property, IP, is not the same as your physical property. What would you say to those arguments?
I would say it's even more worthy of protection than property rights, because if you have a television and someone steals your television, you can get your television back. If you have an invention that you've made and someone steals that, you're not getting that toothpaste back in the tube. That's gone forever. So actually, there is a conception that, for example, the patent is a right that the government grants in order to stimulate innovation, and that I think is a fundamentally flawed version of that. So, if you look at there's a problem we talk about in the other book, the 23 book on trade and competition, where there was a group of islands, I think off the coast of Denmark, the Spitsbergen archipelago, and there were American mining companies that were mining there, and no country had claimed that land while they were mining. And then I think the Danes took over and became the government, and there was a big debate about, what were the rights of these American mining companies, and it became a litigated case. And what the courts or the arbitration panel found was that the rights of the mining companies predated the government, that they were real natural rights, and that the government basically recognized them when it came into power. And similarly with intellectual property rights, what the government is doing when it grants a patent or whatever IP right is being granted is it is recognizing pre-existing work that has gone into that, that is no different from the work that you do on anything else.
Then it becomes illegal to build on that work in some ways. I mean,
well, no, but you're talking about a different thing, which is that there is a genuine debate about the scope of patentability. Mm-hmm. So what I would say is you can't interfere with the property. It is a property right, and you can't interfere with the property right itself. What you can say is there are certain things that were granted patentability or were granted patents that have no business. They aren't actually, they're not actually property rights. And, the test of a patent is novelty, capable of industrial application, with a non-obvious step, to someone who's skilled in the art. That's not obvious to someone who's skilled in the art. Now, if you look at the patents that have been granted over the years, particularly in the US by the US Patent Office, there's lots of things that don't qualify on those things. What that language is about is it's trying to say, what is the actual work we want to reward? Because if you take away that, you take away the entire incentive for doing anything. And
do you?
Yes.
I mean, if you create, if you're creating a product or indeed an idea, say if it's a recipe, whatever it is that is valuable, and you're the first to do it, perhaps you are able to do. The profit motive should be enough, surely. If the government giving you intrinsic value, and therefore, it is illegal for anybody else to build.
Note what you said.
Isn't that
the government gives you? The government doesn't give you anything. The government is recognizing the pre-existing right that you have, and it's for a limited period of time. And I think where it's also legitimate to question is, why should the patent right be 20 years for everything? Why should it be 20? Why should it be 20 years for, let's say, a pharmaceutical that costs $1 billion to produce? No one would produce anything if they didn't have the patent right, and we'd all be back in the dark ages in terms of our health. But why does a business process patent that might be very trivial, why does it have the same length of protection? That's a legitimate question. It's also a legitimate question to query the copyright 70 years plus lifetime of author. Where did that come from? So I think, but the way to deal with that is for the National Academy of Sciences and so forth to do the research, to do the work, to try to determine what is an appropriate length of time to recognize that right. Because if you have none of it at all, then you simply would not get that level of invention.
I take a different view, but that's okay.
Yeah, well, I've written a whole chapter on this in the previous 23 book.
No, I think it's an interesting debate, and it is definitely one that needs to be hashed out. Let's talk about some of the context of what this all means. So I think all of the three pillars are really fascinating, and it's a really interesting way of looking at what anti-competitive market distortions look like overall. And you make some genuine, very specific recommendations to governments, to policymakers, but also to international corporations, to businesses. So what are you? I mean, the task is already big enough, but you also do make these specific recommendations. What are they? What do you think we should be doing in order to bring down some of these distortions?
Yeah. So one of the things we suggested in the other book was a mechanism to take the trade remedy, which currently it deals with anti-dumping and countervailing duties, which is subsidies basically, and it's very price focused, at least with regard to dumping, and to convert that trade remedy into something that deals more with the distortion and the cost effect, and gives you that tarification of the distortion. So a producer can say, well, I've been damaged in this way. And actually what you could do in that case, if indeed the problem is one of competition and not one of price, then you could eliminate the anti-dumping laws and the countervailing duty laws and just simply replace them with this mechanism. So that's one thing that I think you could do. I think countries have to form, coalitions of the willing, alliances with other countries to deal with third country distortion problems. So every trade agreement, we would argue, should have a competition and distortions chapter. First of all, ensuring that we don't distort our markets, and there's some disciplines on countries not to distort their markets, but that also we would apply the same kind of mechanism to third countries, because increasingly, even if the US is the only country doing it, that's not going to be enough with regard to, say, the countries like China. And we use China as a poster child, but it's actually lots of countries.
Yeah. And what do you think was incorrect about the approach that the US has taken early this year?
So I think you've got to give clear signals, and we have actually done quite a lot to try to sort of get the administration to give clear signals. The clear signal you have to give, I would argue, would go something like this. For the last 30 years, distortions have not been dealt with. The national trade estimate, for example, which is the US's inventory of foreign country trade barriers, has grown exponentially. The EU entry, for example, is virtually exactly the same as it was 30 years ago, with more added on. The things that were there haven't been fixed. So I would argue now we need to do something. What we're going to do is we're going to have this mechanism to deal with distortions. We're going to write distortion language into all our trade agreements. We're going to require third countries, our trading partners, to deal in the same way with third countries. We can make an assessment. I'm not opposed to making an assessment of a tarification of those distortions, but it has to be correlated to the scale of the distortion. You've got to basically say to the country, this is the problem. That if you're Japan, if you're Korea, if you're China, if you're whoever, this is the problem, and here's the correlation to those distortions. And critically, they have to know that if they lower those distortions in real time, the tariff's coming down. They can't think that there's something else they can do. Now, I think one of the problems is, first of all, the tarification was based on the deficit, the size of the deficit. It's ironic, actually, because in our index, two of the most distorted countries in the world in this period from 2010 to 23 were Argentina and Brazil. Massively distorted, arguably more distorted than China, actually. Got away with the minimum tariff. Japan, Korea, and China, because the deficit is much bigger. But let's talk about Japan and Korea. China's a special case, but Japan and Korea, deficit is much bigger. They got a much bigger tariff hit. This makes no sense. So I would say the calibration obviously could have been more understandable as a signal. And then as you negotiate, and then what you want to do is you want to lock in trade deals with zero tariffs, where countries have eliminated those distortions and barriers. But you need to signal to the country that that is the problem they need to correct in order to get a zero tariff, and not something else. So in Korea, in Japan, the administration has been talking about, big investment funds, 550 billion in Japan, 350 billion or 330 billion in Korea, which is 20% of Korea's GDP, would be transferred to an entity where the president would control where it's spent, right? So the problem is, actually, it's a lot easier for countries like Japan and Korea to agree to that than to actually deal with their distortions. Distortions are really hard to deal with because there are very powerful people who've put them there. And if you want to change them, you're going to go against those very powerful people.
And very powerful political interests.
Well, they're coming from those powerful people. And so you can't give if that has to be the only thing. Otherwise, they'll do something else. And you won't have solved the problem at all. I think also being very clear, again, that is the problem that we're trying to solve. It isn't about tariffs for revenue. It isn't about getting manufacturing into the US. I mean, if you resolve all these distortions, then there will be investment flow into the US and there will be manufacturing in the US. But what it will be, nobody knows, and that's okay.
That's Hayek's knowledge problem. We can never possibly know exactly what will
right, and nor should we even try. So it's fine not to. All we want to do is get if the problem is lots of distortions in Korea, get a deal US Korea where the distortions are eliminated and zero tariffs apply. And by the way, I've also said to other countries, I was in Korea a few weeks ago talking to them, Japan, even the UK. This is a two-way street. There are plenty of distortions in the US that you can raise. Not only can you raise them in the trade negotiation that you're having, but actually the administration has created a new pathway for you to raise these problems, which is a executive order on eliminating anti-competitive regulation in the US, which is great because that's that second pillar in the US that they're now trying to deal with. So if you have a problem with US regulation, you can go to the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission and say, here's my problem, you need to solve it. And you're talking to people who only care about consumer welfare. They're not interested in producer benefit. So they're looking at that regulation in the US purely from what is its effect on competition. And so you've got a unity of interest between the UK exporter, who is adversely affected by the distortion in the US, and the Federal Trade Commission, Department of Justice, who are also concerned about the distortion in the US. So countries should be able to use those mechanisms and tools because we want to eliminate distortions in the US as well. And so does the president because he's got an executive order on it. So
it was an interesting way of aligning interests, I think, isn't it, in the negotiating process?
Yeah. Well, just one thing. I mean, I have actually for many, many years, including when I was an advisor to I almost said President Romney there, Governor Romney when he was running for president in 2008 and 12, and we recommended at the time that trade negotiations between countries needed to include. They needed to be a negotiation between the trade ministry of one country and the competition agency of the other, because there's a unity of interest between the exporters of country A and the consumers of country B. They will agree a reduction of a barrier. It's the producers of country A and the producers of country B that won't agree. And if you have a negotiation only by ministries that represent those two,
you won't get an agreement.
Yeah, or you'll get an agreement that is a worse common denominator. And so that I think if we don't, and we kind of have that architecture now, so we can actually, I think, make progress on those lines.
Well, that's optimistic. I like that. I've left this to the end because I think I think it's really interesting, but partly because I don't really understand it. So I'm hoping you can tell me a bit about it. The model itself, but also the sort of probabilistic model that you did with this physicism, which I think is fascinating because I don't think that we really see those two disciplines sort of interact with one another enough. Can you explain what you attempted to achieve, at least in one of those chapters where you discuss it, but also why you thought this approach methodically would sort of work best?
Good question. So in chapter 3 and 4 of the book, we go through the economic models that we've used, and basically the main economic model we use is a econometric model. We have 120 countries, 13-year panel data, and we correlate movements in those three pillars: international trade, competition, and property rights with GDP per capita. There's 30 sub-variables in each of these pillars. Part of the problem with any econometric model is data from getting the data for these countries. So we're limited in the data that we have. But nevertheless, we get a pillar score for each of those countries over time. And that correlates to GDP per capita. loss. We have another economic model that we've developed, which is an agent based model, which involves treating. So you have all these agents that are moving around. You put a border between them, i.e., two countries, and you apply the distortion at the border, and you see what the effect on the global output of the system is. And then you apply the distortion inside the border, and you see the effect. And what we see is similar numbers. So there's an 11% reduction in global output for the distortion that's at the border, and there's a 37% reduction of global output for distortions that are inside the border. So again, it's bearing out the kind of numbers we're talking about from the econometric model. But the problem that we saw, and the problem we're trying to correct, is that every economic model is a deterministic model. Even the dynamic, stochastic models are all deterministic models. And the problem is that what I struggled with is, in a world where what you're trying to maximize is voluntary exchange between willing buyer and willing seller, that is an inherently probabilistic interaction. And so what we were thinking is there a better way of modeling that kind of, what is the probability of voluntary exchange occurring? So we use the outputs of the econometric model. We use the outputs of the trade, competition, and property rights pillar scores, and we apply those into a probability density function, which is basically, it's like a curve, a sort of Gaussian curve. And you can say that at where the peak is, that's where the greatest probability of voluntary exchange occurs. These three pillars affect the buyers and sellers. So if I'm in a country where those pillar scores are very high, that's going to increase the probability of voluntary exchange. So I was looking around at other disciplines that model similar things. And actually, in terms of exchange and reactions and so on, the world of quantum physics actually does model something similar in terms of, the position of the electron in the atom and the energy level of the electron in the atom. So I had a background in this. I did quantum mechanics as a master's, and I had met a long time ago, probably 15 years ago, a good friend, became a very good friend, former head of Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. And we sort of put our heads together in about 2009. And we said, what could we do with this? Is there something here? Is there something that could be useful? Now, it's very important with models not to over fetishize them. They're very good at telling you, and I've written a whole book about modeling. So, but they're very good at telling you the sort of direction of travel and the sign and so on. So in my economic model, in the econometric model, the fact that the pillar score of domestic competition is twice as powerful as a mover of GDP per capita as trade, that's a useful insight. Right? It doesn't mean that the exact number is going to be the GDP per capita that you see, but it's a useful insight. And the question was, is there something useful that we can use the quantum mechanics to say? And so we played around with that. And essentially, there's a potential term in a wave equation, which is an equation that ultimately tells you something about the position and energy level of the electron in a hydrogen atom. And so what you're doing is you're saying, what's the potential term? The potential term is, so if this room was basically a space, and willing buyers and sellers were floating around in this room, and so you need to know the probability that they will actually engage in voluntary exchange, and that will be determined by these three pillars of trade and competition and property rights. But that's not the only thing that will determine it, because they're moving towards each other in this room through the air. And the viscosity of the air, if you will, is the medium in which they're traveling. And that's not necessarily only about property rights and competition and trade. So it's also So we use in the sort of quantum model as a potential term things like human capital, institutional strength, use of natural resources. Commercial use of natural resources, not just having natural resources. And we're trying to see if that actually correlates, because in the econometric model we do actually control for those things. So we handle it a slightly different way, but we control for those things in the econometric equation. In the probabilistic equation, obviously, you don't control for it in that way.
So measure it in a way.
And again, data is crucial. So you have to have this parameter that is where there's enough data from the 120 countries and over that 13-year period, and we'll see. Initially, we're getting similar numbers. We're very early stages with this, but we sort of wanted to foreshadow it in the book.
No, I think it's absolutely fascinating, especially for those that are interested in quantum mechanics specifically. I think that modelling human behaviour is always very difficult, and it's sort of partly why I'm a free marketeer, is I don't believe that a central planner really can really discover exactly what happens, but these models are absolutely helpful.
Well, that's the probability aspect of it. That's where I think that so each state that the quotes electron is in is defined by a different probability density function. So is there something in the way those probability density functions look that captures some of that inherent unknowability of the transaction?
And it's helpful for those of us that want there to be a higher probability of those interactions occurring in the first place, which is ultimately the aim of the world being a better place.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing about it is from a sort of IEA perspective.
Yeah.
It's a very Hayekian model, because it's all about, it's built on voluntary exchange. What is interesting about it is it's not built on equilibrium. In fact, we don't think there really is an equilibrium.
No.
So this sort of classical idea of a supply and demand curve and an equilibrium point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, we don't think that's a very helpful way of looking at interactions between individuals. We think trying to say something about the probability of voluntary exchange is much more helpful. And this is one of the reasons why all the economic models that we have been so monumentally unsuccessful at predicting anything. And we're seeing this now with the budget, where they're quibbling about 5 billion here, 5 billion there, when we're already paying about 350 billion in just the debt and interest and the NHS by itself. So how are you really telling me that you can predict this that accurately? I don't think.
No.
So being able to say something, and the other thing about the quantum model is I think it will also do a better job of picking up the dynamic effects. So, for example, when New Zealand and China did a trade deal, New Zealand Treasury, various other people modelled what it would be. It achieved the level of trade. It achieved in 11 months what the Treasury prediction said it would achieve in 11 years.
Wow.
So there's something about that, those dynamic effects that's not being captured
in
properly.
Classical model.
And partly they're not being captured, and we write about this in the book as well, because if you start from an equilibrium model, basically the problem is that the deadweight losses are too small. The Harburger triangles and the whatever shape you want to come up with that connotes moving away from the equilibrium point, those shapes, those deadweight losses are too small. They don't accurately reflect the losses you impose when you distort markets. And that's what we hope that the quantum model will do better.
Shanker, this has been absolutely fascinating. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I feel as though I could listen to you talk about the global economy for a few hours longer, but I'll spare our listeners. Yes. And thank you to all of you for watching and listening. If you want to actually purchase the book, I believe it's available on Routledge. Is that right?
Yep. Yes, you can get it.
So you can go and find it. We'll put the link over in the description. It is an absolutely fantastic read. And thank you to all of you for watching and listening. If you're interested in learning more about the IEA's work, then do check out Insider.com. iea.org.uk.